In my video about how feminists seem to have an abortion fetish, I quoted Flanagan's article from The Atlantic, where she takes the very centrist perspective and basically says that both sides make very good arguments. Now, in that video, I left out almost the first 2/3 of the article. It would have made it too long and wasn't salient to my video. But in that article, she points out that before abortion was legalized, women would have to go to great lengths to perform abortions themselves, and even companies like Lysol were advertising their products as an aborticide for women. She shared the heartbreaking testimonies of women that had performed Lysol-induced abortions themselves, and once they realized something had gone terribly wrong, they had to put their shame and guilt to the side and call a doctor to try to save themselves, often too late. And many women died this way. Using Lysol was significantly more deadly than other methods of abortion. Her argument was, look at the lengths women will go to do what they want to do, and if it can be performed in a safer way, in a way that saves more women's lives, then we should allow that to happen. Flanagan is on the pro-choice side of the argument. Now, she does have a more nuanced take than a lot of feminists do, but in the end, she does agree abortion should be legal. The problem for me is that most abortions today are done in the name of convenience. Abortions that are for rape and incest account for less than 1% of all abortions. It's rarely ever for the health of the mother either. These are lies. This is why it's framed as women's choice. Are you okay with the inconvenience of having a healthy child? Or are you in a place in life where you can have a kid, or it's something you plan for? If not, then that's where abortion comes in. It's a baby you can't wait to meet if you do want it. It's a burden, a problem, a clump of cells if you don't. And so, if women will go to such great lengths to get rid of the baby pre-Roe v. Wade, it seems to me to be a moral issue, not a health issue. It's a moral failing that women would go to such great lengths to kill their own offspring, risking even killing themselves in the process. But to say it should be legalized, simply to avoid the consequences that women face from doing it themselves, is a broken argument. Should theft be legal? Many people have suffered enormous consequences for stealing, and people will always steal no matter what law you enforce against it. How many bank robberies have ended up with the robber ending up in prison or shot dead? In the infamous 1997 LA bank robbery shootout, 2 armed men robbed $1.5 million from inside the bank and began a massive shootout with police. 12 officers were wounded, 8 citizens were also injured, and the 2 robbers themselves ended up dead. Would it not have been easier to just hand them the money to avoid all the loss of life, injuries, emotional trauma, and property damage that occurred in the aftermath when it was denied to them? This incident, along with the Miami-Dade shootout, also led to the militarization of the police when they realized that they were outgunned by the bad guys. They only had little 6-shooters and bolt-action hunting rifles, whereas the shooters had fully automatic ARs, pistols, tons of ammo, and bulletproof armor. Studies have linked an increase in police militarization to an increase in police killings. And the payouts to those families that lost a loved one from police brutality between 1997 and now is definitely over 1.5 million. We could have avoided all of that from just giving these guys that money. Surely they needed it more than the bank did, right? And yet theft is still illegal today, isn't it? Despite all that, forcing even more people to choose between life and possible death, to engage in needlessly dangerous behaviors that regardless of the legality, they will always do. Do we as society value materialistic possessions over life? Do we value property more than human dignity? You see, I can take anything and put this retarded spin on it. The fact that people go to great lengths to do immoral things does not justify the legalization of those things, simply to avoid the consequences of those actions. And here we get to an important junction, whether abortion is immoral or not. Now, Caitlin pointed out that at the end of the first trimester, babies are having hiccups, their face has basically developed into what they'll look like when they're born, they'll have fingers and toes and a heartbeat, they'll have their sex organs. On average, they're 3 inches long and they weigh 1 ounce. Clearly, this is a human being, albeit one in the early stages, but it definitely has the human characteristics. And yet, clearly, it's not a human earlier on. It is just a bunch of cells at the start. And that can't be the same as a life. If it were every time I scratch my nose, I'd be committing mass genocide. So clearly, when it's just a little zygote, it's not a life. But at some point along the way, we have to put the label of a life on it. For me personally, that's the heartbeat. That seems to be the most innate and tangible sense of human life there is to me. Some people use the life at conception argument, and I don't like that because it has flaws. Their argument is this: after 9 months and the baby is born, it's clearly a life. But what about the day before? It could have just as easily been born that day. Babies are born prematurely all the time. Why would it not be a life at that point either? At 21 weeks, which is where a lot of states prohibit abortion after that, the baby can live outside the womb. And if it were to be delivered on that day, we'd recognize it as a person. But what about the day before? Or the same with the heartbeat. What about the day before its heart starts beating? Was it not a life that day? And so on and so forth until you get back to the moment of conception, which makes it a life from start to finish. But clearly, for reasons I've already stated, it can't be a life at the beginning. It's simply too underdeveloped, too non-viable, and too not lifelike. If you were to find a couple breadcrumbs on the table, no one would call that a peanut butter sandwich. And this day before logic doesn't work when applied to other things. Let's take an 18-year-old teenager. That's the age of sexual consent. She's now able to have sex with other adults like her. But what about the day before she turned 18? She was almost guaranteed to be the exact same person, the same maturity level, the same amount of physical development. What about the day before that, or the day before that? Where do you draw the line when chances are she'll share all the same characteristics as she will when she turns 18? There's nothing particularly remarkable in terms of development that happens on her 18th birthday. Well, she's not mature enough to consent to sexual relationships with other adults, you say. Well, that's completely subjective. There's 40-year-old men who are too immature to be in a sexual relationship with a woman. They even made a movie about it. And then there's 16-year-olds at Harvard right now who consented to hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt because they're mature enough to be there and take on that massive life-changing debt, and who may already be sexually active. And yet none of that matters to us, does it? It's still revolting to us to think of a 30-year-old man having sex with a 14 or a 16-year-old girl, and so we set the limit at 18 to prevent unnecessary harm from happening to children. And so it is with the heartbeat for me. Yes, you could do the day before logic, but it doesn't work like that. The heartbeat is the start of things. Now, I've seen a lot of pro-choice people get upset at this because the heartbeat starts fairly early. It's detectable around 5 or 6 weeks, which if you legalize abortion before then would shorten the time between conception and there to almost nothing. Is it immoral to put an end to something's heartbeat? Seems like it. It seems more immoral than stealing $10 or a candy bar from the store. It seems more immoral than lying does to me. Stopping a heartbeat that will continue beating perfectly fine until birth and then keep on beating while they live their life until they die seems immoral to me. Let's say we colonize Mars, and as we explore, we come across a big egg that has a pulsating light coming from the inside. And through the thin shell, you can see a little fetus-like creature floating around in fluid. And then someone comes in and stomps on it with a boot and crushes the shell, and the lights go out. And that little creature lays there lifeless and smushed flat. Was that immoral? Seems immoral to me. I guess my position is, if it has a heartbeat, it's off limits. And if that makes the world a more complicated place, oh well. No more complicated than theft being off limits. No more complicated than the left pushing gun control on a nation with more guns than people. Or amnesty. Or a $15 minimum wage. How complicated is our tax code? Pretty damn complicated. And yet we all manage to file our taxes without complication most of the time. Some immoral people will always try to do it whether it's legal or not, no matter the personal cost, just out of desperation. The fact that it's lawful now, and has been for 50 years, doesn't matter. The fact that a lot of women do it doesn't matter. Slavery was legal, and a lot of people did that, and had some pretty elaborate reasons for doing so. And yet none of that matters, does it? And I'm open to some possible exceptions. I'm not a robot. I'm not heartless. I know that some situations would require some finesse. But I refuse to believe that the 62 million abortions that have been done since Roe v. Wade fall into those categories. Just food for thought. That's all I've got for today. As always, if you like this video and type of content, consider liking this video or maybe subscribing. See you in the next video. Peace.